This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
The following story is true. It's part of an active and ongoing investigation, and if you have any information that could help, contact your local FBI field office or visit tips.fbi.gov. There are parts of this show that may not be suitable for all audiences.
I had actually had an ambush set up here in Anchorage, and that one got really close. APD showed up. They came out to tell the people that the park was closed. It was about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and there's a young couple out there in their car, and I had the parking lot with the park staked out. APD showed up. Could have got ugly, but fortunately for the cop guy, his backup showed up. I mean, APD is really good. Like they're really good. Like all by the book and stuff. And that's about the time that I decided to get a scanner, because I almost got myself into a lot of trouble on that one, because I had no way. I didn't think that they would call in backup just for some kids sitting out in a park. Almost pulled the trigger even with him there, and that would have got really ugly really fast. Well, as soon as his backup showed up, I decided I better call it a night, and got back on my bike and took off.
Israel Keyes is known for the things he did.
But the things he said he didn't do, the things he said he almost did, that's an important window into who he was too.
How much is true? Did he actually almost shoot those police in Alaska like he says?
Did he almost take a woman in a park while in Texas like he says?
Did he actually almost take a man in a yellow Volkswagen rather than the couriers like he says?
Or is this all just him trying to build his own legend?
There's no way to know, no way to prove it. All we have are words and mystery, a puzzle, unsolved to this day, that he enjoyed watching others try to solve.
And as we turn to his final days, his final games, it turns out that puzzle is all that he would leave behind.
We're all wired differently. Some of us are wired for good, some of us are wired for bad. But a select few step outside all of society's boundaries. From cold open media, this is Deviant. Israel Keyes. Part 7.
Welcome back to Deviant, where we chase the truth into the dark corners of what humans are capable of. I'm Dan Szematowicz.
And I'm Andrew Iden.
This is our last full episode on Israel Keyes. And next week, we're going to be doing a sort of loose ends episode where we talk about some of the things that were interesting, but we just didn't have room for. Things that just deepen the mystery even more, like what's up with those weird, mysterious surgeries that he had in Mexico? What's the connection to Belize and his death? And what about some of the higher profile names that people think may have been a victim of Israel Keyes? We'll get into all that. And also, we're going to be answering your questions. And if you have any questions for us, there are a couple ways to submit them. First, if you're listening to the show on a platform that allows you to leave reviews or comments, please leave your questions there. And while you're at that, make sure to follow us on that platform. It helps out the show a lot. Secondly, our Patreon. Check out our Patreon by going to deviantpodcast.com. There, you can see all sorts of behind-the-scenes material. Watch us as we prepare the show, look at some of the documents and videos that we're talking about, and also get access to Q&A sessions with me and Andrew. Yeah, you can leave questions and comments through Patreon and on our Discord as well, which you'll be able to join when you sign up. And of course, there's also social. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at deviant.podcast, and you can ask us questions there too. All right, so with all that said, let's get into the show.
Israel Keyes was arrested in March of 2012. What happened before then, we've made that trip together.
The murders, the arsons, the robberies.
Vermont, Alaska, and Texas. And in October and November of that year, he tells investigators that he's killed 4 more in Washington state.
Again, no names, no details, other than he took a couple. They're buried somewhere, and he disposed of at least one other victim in Lake Crescent in northern Washington.
Police don't find remains there, but they do confiscate a boat he owned at the time. They find blood on the boat, but it's still not clear who that blood belongs to.
And while all this is going on, Israel is asking for an execution date. He wants to be put to death by the federal government. In exchange, he says he'll lay out all the cards he's been holding, tell all his stories of all his crimes. But because it's the federal government, the process moves very slowly.
Even having those kinds of discussions in the Justice Department means reams of paperwork and many layers of bureaucracy.
Kill me, federal government. It's not an everyday request.
And while Israel continues sitting in jail, he gets frustrated with authorities and their seeming inability to get him what he wants.
I just don't see where I have any incentive to give you any more information right now, because all this stuff is going to happen to me anyway. I mean, whether I'm charged federally or in Vermont, I don't even understand how they can charge me in Vermont, because Feltus told me this was a federal crime. So that was the whole idea of me giving you like the guns and the silencers and all that crap, because I thought it was all going to be federal, and now you're saying they want to charge me locally, and I don't even, whatever, you're the lawyer, so.
Time moves, but action doesn't. Keyes puts out signals that all of this, his questioning, trial, punishment, may end sooner than anticipated.
It's not a new idea. Keyes alludes to it repeatedly and in different ways.
We already all know how this ends, so, all I care about is what happens between now and whenever it ends. And if things don't go the way I want, I don't need you guys.
He's put on suicide watch, and he's very not happy about it. Former Anchorage police detective Jeff Bell sees that in person.
I had to do a strip search on him every time we picked him up from jail, which was almost daily. So I would get him in a private room at the jail from his cell. Then I'd have to do a strip search on him. And one of the times I had him in the room, locked in the room, metal doors, no windows. They had an emergency in the jail. So I was like stranded. They forgot about me in this 10 by 10 room with Israel Keyes. And I kept hitting the buzzer to try to get out, and no answer. And I think he could sense that I was a little bit, more than a little bit nervous about that. And eventually I got my cell phone out and I called a buddy I had who worked at the jail. He answered, and fortunately the cell phone worked. And I was like, can you get me out of this room? And so he got me out. And then the other time was when he was on suicide watch, and they pulled him into the room, and he was wearing a paper gown, and he was if he could have reached out and strangled me, he would have. He was very upset about being put on the suicide watch. And so we suspected that he could be suicidal at that point in time. And I know that after that, one time I went to pick him up, and he had gotten rid of the gown and convinced him to get him out of the suicide ward, but he had a pair of tennis shoes on with shoelaces on him. And so I put him in my car, and I went back in to the guy that I knew in the jail there, and I said, "Really? Shoelaces? You guys on suicide watch." They bought him a electric shaver so that he didn't get blades. They had that in the sergeant's desk, which was supposed to be given to him. And I'm like, "You guys got shoelaces." And so they didn't handle that the way I would have preferred they handled it, because they told him when he got back to jail, well, Bell said, "Notice the shoelaces. He doesn't want you to have shoelaces." And so we suspected that he was capable of that very early on.
On December 2nd, 2012, Israel Keyes makes a decision. Whether he knows it or not, that decision means that understanding all he's done and figuring all of it out, that's up to everyone else moving forward.
I was on a SWAT call out when he killed himself. In fact, we had just made entry into a home. It was probably 6 a.m. We had been out all night, and I was physically in the room, standing over the bed of the suspect, pointed in when I was grabbed on the shoulder by another teammate and said, "Commander needs to see you." And so I went out, and he said, "Israel Keyes just killed himself. You need to get to the jail." And so I went to the jail in my SWAT uniform. Myself and Jolene were the first ones, obviously, in the room, besides medical personnel, to investigate that and take photos and things like that. I was pretty angry at him at that point in time.
You were angry at Keyes?
Yeah. Took the easy way out. And then, of course, once that happened, I look back on our last interview with him when I said something about, "We'll see you on Thursday," or whenever it was that we had kind of planned. He kind of said yes, and then did his laugh. And I'm sure you've listened to the interviews. He has a very disturbing, distinct laugh, and so he did that. And I'm sure it was, looking back, he knew then what his intentions were.
He was on suicide watch when he committed suicide, right?
He wasn't.
Oh, he wasn't.
He wasn't. He was on isolation, but he did have some specific rules special to him. And the main one was when prisoners in Max go to the shower, they get those little disposable razors with a single blade in it, right? And the guard is standing at the entrance to the shower. They give them to him. They observe him shave. And when they step out of the shower, they hand this razor back to the guard. And this guard inspects it to make sure that the blade is still in it, right? Because that can be a weapon if it's not. And so early on, their idea, somebody went to the store, bought him an electric razor, and there was a note on his door that said, do not give him a razor. There's an electric razor in the sergeant's desk for him to use. And I got in trouble for this with my direct corrections buddies in a book that was written. But, the lieutenant essentially told me, all I can do is write it down. If they can't read it or don't follow it, there's not much I can do about it. Because what ended up happening was instead of giving him the electric razor, one of the guards gave him one of those big disposable razors. He was able to get the blade out of it. I don't know how, while he was in the shower, and he gave the empty one back to the guard and took that blade to his cell and was able to embed that blade into a golf pencil, which you would use for keeping score on a golf. He was able to embed that in the side of that pencil and essentially make a razor knife out of it.
Keyes wants to make sure he gets some kind of last word in, one last puzzle.
During his suicide, what was found was the note that was curled up in a ball in his hands, placed strategically in the most bloody part of his body and on the bed on purpose, written partially in ink, partially in lead, because he knew that the product to get the blood out was different for lead than it was for ink. He knew how hard it was going to be for the FBI to get that blood out of there. And I'm sure he laughed all the way to hell, knowing that the note actually didn't mean much. It was a bunch of gibberish.
FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole says that wasn't just an act. It was a statement.
His decision to commit suicide did maintain the narrative about his other victims. And I think what's really interesting in some of these cases, not all serial sexual killers are alike. I mean, there's variation amongst them. But with someone like Israel going over his case and how he identified who he was going to murder and how he murdered, and also looking at his upbringing, one of the things that's really striking is I believe that he felt he owned the victims. They were his objects. Serial sexual killers, because of their psychopathy, do not view their victims as human beings. They belong to them. They are their property. And to sit down and tell law enforcement about that means that you're helping law enforcement. You're giving them your property. Oh, no. Oh, no. So I think some of his victims he was never going to talk about because they were his property.
Detective Bell believes that too.
I believe once he told us about Samantha, once he told us about the couriers, he felt a sense of loss of those souls or those people. I know you've seen the photograph probably of the blood skulls, and one of them says, "We are one." And I believe he had some ownership in those stories and those souls or whatever in his demented mind. And that once he told law enforcement about one, that soul or that person kind of escaped his grasp, and he wasn't the only one that knew.
It's Lee Come Key.
Welcome back to the Lee Come Key request line. Ready for something with a kick that's still smooth? Talk about a hot time at dinner time.
Crisscross.
This is America's #1 spicy mayo and non-GMO verified sriracha. It's the Sriracha Slide coming at you from Lee Come Key.
Turn it out.
Sriracha Slide on over to srirachalove.com to check it out.
Sriracha real smooth.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Now that Israel Keyes is dead, police have to pair the things he gave them with what they uncover on their own. It's not much, and hasn't been since. The thousands of FBI documents we obtained show tips, reach outs to other departments, and all that minutia of police work.
Where was Keyes and when?
Where did he use his credit cards?
Where did his cell phone ping and when did he shut it off?
Where did he bury caches and kill kits?
And where does all that information intersect with missing people or unexplained homicides?
There's the case of Jimmy Tidwell, and we talked about that back in episode 5. Did Israel Keyes kill Tidwell? Well, there are a lot of pieces that make sense. And as far as we're concerned, it's the one that has the highest degree of possibility. Keyes is in the area where he went missing at the time he goes missing.
And of course, Keyes' reference to using human hair during the bank robbery in nearby Azle. As we worked our way through those FBI documents, a couple of names jumped out at us. One of those, Alice Ida Looney. She disappears in August of 2004, and her body is found more than a year later on the south end of the Yakima Tribal Reservation in Washington State. During our conversation with Jeff Bell, he makes a passing reference to who he believes was one of Keyes' early unknown victims.
I believe that one of Israel's victims, at least one for sure, early on, is from Ellensburg area of Washington.
When Alice is found more than a year after going missing, it's on that tribal reservation not far from Ellensburg, Washington. So what about Keyes? His specific location on the day Alice went missing? Nobody knows. But we do know that it's the same time he's working in Washington with the Nia Bay Parks and Recreation Department. As of this recording, the Yakima Tribal Police haven't yet returned our calls.
Then there's the story of Delmer Wayne Sample. He goes missing on March 4th of 2005 on the way to Tillamook, Oregon, 150 miles southwest of his home in Onalaska, Washington.
His truck is found that same day near a trailhead at Lake Quinault, Washington, 100 miles northwest of his home in Onalaska, the original departure point.
And Israel Keyes, he's on a canoe trip on March 1st and on a ferry in Edmonds, Washington on March 9th. For 8 days, he's off the radar.
So what does it say in those FBI documents about Delmer Wayne Sample? Well, it says a detailed timeline of Keyes' whereabouts has been created, which make the disappearance difficult to attribute to Keyes due to a narrow time window. They have him moving east, but it's more of a general direction than more of a specific location. It should be noted, however, the document continues, that Keyes acknowledges in interviews that he keeps a tight schedule during his criminal activity to avoid detection. Due to these factors, Keyes has not been definitely ruled out as a suspect.
And when we contacted the Lewis County Sheriff's Office about the Sample case, they had a similar refrain we've heard a lot on our calls to different jurisdictions. Quote, "We have nothing that links it, but nothing to rule it out either. Nothing that leads us in that direction," end quote. In 20 words and a brief call to authorities, it's a snapshot of the entire Israel Keyes dilemma. All that information also gave credence to what Israel may have done if he stayed careful and didn't get caught.
He had a plan, and he does give police a glimpse of this plan, the next level, the evolution of his MO, what he calls his grand plan.
I'd come to the conclusion over the last couple of years that it wasn't even an option for me anymore, that I wasn't going to be able to cohabitate with anyone.
And why was that?
I just couldn't separate the two lives anymore.
So you thought that just wasn't workable in the long run?
Yeah, it was just becoming less maintainable. And like you say, my my self-control, it felt like it was no longer to the point where I could put things off till next trip or whatever. My solution was get a travel trailer and be a nomad, I guess.
Oh, that's what you were thinking you would just do, is just live in a travel trailer or travel around or whatever.
Yeah.
Did you have plans for the future?
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. I was going to be a traveling contractor. Follow the hurricanes. Pretty feasible explanation for why I would live that way.
He has it all worked out, and he practices it with his customized guns and tools.
I had a whole target system set up there. I had, I'm going to give away my grand plan here, but I had a moving target system to where I could trip the target and it would start rolling downhill on a pulley. And it was just a piece of printer paper, but then I would put a black mark, like spray paint a black mark. That's what I was shooting at with it, about 50 yards. That was the plan I had. I didn't actually end up doing it that way, but that's one of the ideas I had for carjacking someone. Shoot out their tire while they were pulling up to a stop sign or something. Didn't find any good roads or places to do it. So. pretty easy. People are pretty, especially if you get out in the backwoods, people are pretty naive and don't really expect anything bad to happen to them. So you don't really have to do anything as crazy as shoot out their tires. But that was one of the ideas I've had, partly because you're on a road with the right amount of traffic, you can set up in the right spot and sit there with binoculars and kind of stake out who's in the car, kind of like shopping.
And that draw attention to the shooting at the tires thing.
Well, in the evening, and there's not a lot of people around. It's on a backwoods road that gets a car every 5 or 10 minutes. You shoot out someone's tire. She's by herself, and she doesn't have much choice but to stop. And if you shoot it out with a 22 on the sidewall, she's going to have to stop probably within half a mile of where you shoot it out. That was part of the plan I had. There were other reasons why I wanted a silencer that was still accurate, too.
You got me more curious about the caches and stuff now, too. You know, how many caches are there?
In Washington?
Washington, United States, Canada.
The idea with caches is to have something everywhere.
Do you have a cache in Washington? Is there guns buried in Washington?
There's stuff buried in Washington.
So now we come to the big question, the one we've been asking since the very first episode. How far did Israel Keyes actually go? How many people did he actually murder? We'll give the first word to investigators, and we want to give a big thanks to FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin and Detective Jeff Bell for being so generous with their time. So as we kick things over to them for a bit, and just to lay the foundation, they both believe that he killed 11.
He told us less than 12. I believe those skull drawings represent his victims.
They're confident, but not sure. Jeff thinks that as things currently stand, matching the unknown victims to Keyes is a long shot.
I believe that the way it will happen, if it happens, it's my belief that he has a cache of potential trophies or things that could identify victims in Port Angeles, Washington. He told us that he had 2 caches there, which is near Nia Bay, and it's near Lake Crescent, where I believe at least 2 of his victims are. And he said that one of the caches were things that were his, which I would interpret as guns, things that he could use for his crimes. And then he said the other cache were things that were not his. My interpretation of that is that those things are things he stole or things that would identify his victims. We never found Samantha Koenig's ID. He may have burnt that in the fireplace. I don't know. But things like that, I think, could be in that cache. And so if that cache were to be found, it would obviously be an accident, probably a 5-gallon bucket. And it would be during some type of construction phase of some, who knows, neighborhood or something. Where if that was found, it wasn't just rolled up with an excavator and into a pile.
FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin.
Other than the 4 homicides, 4 victims that we've talked about, we really have not been able to tie Keyes to any other missing person concretely. That's for a couple of reasons. Sadly, he was very good at what he did. If we look at the cache of evidence that we found at Blake River Falls.
That's the cache that was recovered in New York after Keyes admitted to the Courier murders.
That's where we had the guns and all of those kind of things. All of those pieces of evidence, we found 1 fingerprint. 1. He was very good at what he did. Really, the only way that we are going to definitively tie Keyes to a victim is going to be, DNA or something significant like that. Likely what we're going to be able to do is tie Keyes to an area, a time, a location when somebody went missing, and that's what we'll have. And we can make assumptions that Keyes was responsible. And we have not been able to really tie him to any other missing persons yet.
It's a weird correlation sometimes between him going somewhere and then bodies showing up shortly thereafter. And I know coincidences happen, and I'm not trying to tie anything that shouldn't be tied together, but it's a weird feeling to make those kinds of notes. At least for me, it is.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I guess just because we weren't able to put him in a location doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't involved. With time, investigations become a little easier because of social media, digital evidence, and those kind of things that didn't exist and or that he avoided for so long. I mean, he didn't get caught until he actually committed crimes in populated societies where there could be cameras. His other crimes all took place in remote places where there weren't those type of things, or in a time when those didn't exist as commonplace. I believe that he was really good at picking locations where there weren't cameras until the couriers. And then obviously that's what drove him to Samantha Koenig, in my opinion, is that he, early on in his serial killer phase, it was enough adrenaline for him to know he did the killing and he did the bank robberies and he did those things. But once the couriers happened, it was so public. I believe that he got so much more enjoyment and adrenaline out of watching law enforcement trying to figure out who did it and then not being able to figure out it was him. He made a comment to us about Samantha Koenig's case that we looked like ants in a frying pan trying to figure it out. And I think that just like any other drug, adrenaline is something that he had, that killing and raping and bank robbing is what filled that adrenaline. And so he had to up the ante each time after the couriers to give himself the high and the satisfaction that he used to get by just knowing that he did it and nobody else knowing he did.
By the time he got to Samantha, it seems like he was almost losing control, because however many killings he had before then, they were all, I guess, would be categorized. I know this technically isn't the category anymore, but an organized serial offender, right? Like, he was very organized, beyond organized, probably the most organized that one could think.
In fact, that's what the FBI would say, that they would agree with you. He was one of the most organized serial killers ever, in that had he kept on the same path of remoteness and those kind of things, he may still not have today have been caught, and he'd be continuing to do it. It was his desire for something more than he was getting previously. And he kind of described that to us in a way, which is why I believe that, is that he liked going to social events and parties and looking around at people and thinking to himself, man, if they only knew the real me, if they only really knew what I did. And he kind of got a high out of that.
Was there a question that you didn't get to ask Keyes that you wish you had the opportunity to ask?
No. I mean, no. Not that I believed that he would answer it, right? I asked him as many different ways as I could and pleaded with him to try to give us more information. And, he was professional about it. He'd just say, I just don't have the same, I understand your empathy. I understand what you're doing for these families. I just don't have the same empathy you do. And I don't see it the same way. If I had somebody missing in my life, I'm not sure I'd want to know that they met somebody like me, and what happened to them at my hands is what happened, or would I want to think that they were on a beach somewhere drinking a Mai Tai of their own free will, that type of thing. And so he just didn't care about the victims' families or the victims in the way that I did. He cared about them in that he believed that he owned them. And, after taking their life, he owned their soul, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make sense to me.
To me, Israel Keyes was sort of a new breed, the type of serial offender that we have not seen before. No victimology. The premeditation he displayed was otherworldly. If someone like Israel Keyes can exist, and I know sometimes serial offenders, Keyes said he did this, looked at other serial offenders from the past, learned from them. If someone like Israel Keyes can exist, is there someone else out there working right now who's learned from Israel Keyes?
There certainly could be. Keyes isn't the first serial killer that talked about researching other serial killers and learning from them. And so I think absolutely, and especially now where we are at with the internet and social media and just so much information being out there, I think we're in a place where it is very easy to learn about other crimes and other MOs and the way that people work. So, unfortunately, I think that's certainly possible.
Jolene says that the work continues, that this is an active and ongoing investigation.
I genuinely say that we continue to work every lead that comes in. There are two of us in Anchorage. This happened in 2012 and it's 2024, and we're still here in Anchorage. We are still working this case that we're on the original case. And so it's definitely very near and dear to us. And so if anybody does have information, anybody does have any suspicion, you don't have to know 100%, but if you have any suspicion that Keyes may be responsible for a particular missing person or a homicide, to definitely reach out to us. And we look at every single one of those reports that come in.
Here again is Mary Ellen O'Toole. She agrees with Jeff Bell. It's possible he was never going to say anything else.
For Israel, I think control was a big part of who he was just as a person. But I can tell you, based on other serial sexual killers who I've interviewed and whose cases that I've worked on, control is a big issue for most of them. And you can see it in their crimes, because if you can't control your victims, you can't murder them. But also in interviews, control is a big deal. And I think that really goes to their basic personality makeup. We estimate that about 95% of serial sexual killers are psychopaths. The old term was sociopath. There are certain personality traits associated with someone who has a psychopathic personality. And one of the things that becomes really obvious when you spend time with them is for them to be very dominant. One of the traits is grandiosity, which means they're more important and they're more significant than anything else in the universe, which means they will control everything around them. So I think it's applicable in this case in the interviews that he gave up as much as he wanted to. He gave it up when he wanted to, how he wanted to. So control was a huge issue. And then you consider control of Israel Keys in terms of when he was done. He was done and he committed suicide. And that suicide was not done out of depression or a sense of regret over what he did to the victims. When someone who is a psychopath commits suicide, and they will, it's because they want to control their life and how their life will come to an end. They want to control it. Not you as the detective, not you as the FBI agent. They want to control what happens to them. But also, I've learned from talking to these individuals that cases that people don't talk about, they may have screwed up, so they don't want you to know. Or they may have engaged in other sexual behaviors they don't want you to know about. So there's other reasons that they may not be willing to talk about other cases, but the sense that these victims belong to them could be a very important reason to take them to their grave. When we talk about serial killers maybe on death row or spending a life in prison, the question always comes up, well, do you think when they're on their deathbed, they will give it all up? They'll tell us everything so that we can go to the families and say, this is what happened to your loved one, and that they will do the right thing. No, they will take the information to the grave.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
And now it's our turn. We've talked about the trail of maybes in this case, the murders and disappearances for which Israel may be responsible.
In some cases, he hinted at it. In others, the math adds up between where Israel was at a given time and place.
If you've done any research into Keys, there are a lot of names that pop up. Some are more credible than others. And just to be clear, any names and possibilities that we mention come directly from the FBI files we pick through. So if you're asking, why aren't you talking about this person or that person? The answer is we're keeping our focus in the same place the FBI and local police kept theirs. And for some of those names that may be on your mind, we did call on them and some agencies did respond, and some of those conversations helped us actually cross some names off our list. Others didn't, either not returning our calls and emails or citing active and ongoing investigations.
All this prompts a question and a part of the Key story that we had never considered until we talked to former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole.
Whenever I got a serial sexual case to work, I never wanted to only focus on those victims that became part of the series. I also wanted to look for the practice murders. And practice murders are the ones that come before the person becomes a legitimate serial killer. In other words, they're good at what they do. They know the weapon. They know how to plan. They know how to follow. They know how to fight with someone that fights back with them. That's when they become really an expert at what they do. I want to look at the practice crimes, which would include practice murders. That's when they figure out, I'd rather use a gun to access the victim or a ligature. This is how I apply a ligature. So all of those crimes that pre-exist the series become important, but those series are where they make a lot of mistakes, and a serial killer doesn't want you to know the practice ones because that's where they screw up. So I would be looking for the 11 that were part of the series where he really knew what he was doing, but I'd go back about 2 or 3 years before the first victim that you can identify, and look for practice murders.
Interesting. Where is the line between where the practice murders end and the series begins?
Well, that's a tough one, because once it's the series, that's when the modus operandi has really become part of the crime and the signature has become pretty stabilized. So you see the MO is, I'm going to go after victims that are by themselves. I'm going to go after victims that have these other qualities about them. And the MO becomes sort of stabilized. But you may not be exactly right. You could be off. And that's always an issue. It's not with 100 degrees certainty that you have a fine line of demarcation between practice and the series.
So if there are 11 in the series, are we looking in all the right places if he did engage in practice kills?
Do Canadians really not count? If those 11 began after he got out of the army, are there more victims before he went in?
Should we be looking back in Colville when he was running around the woods, burning things and hurting animals?
When it comes down to it, though, Keyes just liked killing. Here's what we think. Andrew's going to go first here.
I've entertained a lot of different thoughts during the making of this show. One that I think we can all agree on is that Israel Keyes is, without question, one of the most disturbed people any of us has ever come across. What he did to his victims, what he did to their families, and the ripple effect all of that has had on anyone in his orbit, including his family, girlfriends, wife, his daughter, is absolutely horrific. But there's an interesting wrinkle to Keyes that's not often seen in the serial killer realm. I don't really think he sought notoriety. I don't think books, movies, podcasts like this about him were ever part of his plan. And there's been plenty of those. Ted Bundy, BTK, they were malignant narcissists. Glory hounds. Israel Keyes, I don't think, was a glory hound. He did what he did just because he liked it. Period. I entertained early on in the making of this show that maybe he's a blowhard, lying narcissist who likes the sound of his own voice. Maybe that number of 11 was all hot air. You know, go out with some sort of last best lie. But here's what I do know. He's certainly capable and likely responsible. And when you look at the nomadic, wandering existence that he lived, and the remote corners he explored over the course of his life, 11 almost seems like not enough. And I've wondered, maybe those 11 skulls aren't his victim count at all. Maybe it's the number of states where he committed murders. Maybe it's the years in which he was active. The FBI did say they believe he started killing in 2001. And if his final victim was in 2012, then that would be, in fact, 11 years. And the pentagram he also included in those drawings, he said in his conversations with law enforcement he'd rejected religion, and at some point outgrew any kind of satanic worship. That may have just been something to throw investigators off. But I think oftentimes, especially when it comes to interpreting the words and actions of people like Keyes, we're lured into putting a lot more meaning into it than we should. Dan and I have certainly both been guilty of that when debating this story.
Oh yes, big time.
So as far as how far Israel Keyes went, that victim count, 11 seems like the logical place to start. I think that in death, Israel Keyes just wanted someone to know. But what's important about that number is that it's people we're talking about. 11 lives, 3 families, the Koenigs, the Couriers, and the Feldmans, forever changed. And 8 more, still looking.
The thing about these kinds of stories is that you want them to be simple. You want them to make sense. And when you think about someone like Israel Keyes, he is someone who operated in complexities. Nothing that he did was easy or simple. He put the work into it. He put the planning into it. He traveled everywhere. Most serial sexual offenders, most serial killers, they tend to stick to one geographic location, right? Their block, their house, their neighborhood, their town, city, whatever. And they tend to have one general kind of victim. Male, female, blonde, brunette, big, small. Keyes sort of operated in a combination of simplicity and complexity, right? He made everything leading up to the crime itself incredibly complicated. It took an incredible amount of forethought to do what he did for as long as he did it and without getting caught. That's what made him so effective. But once he found his victim, it was pretty simple. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he did it. Now that number 11, my gut says that those 11 skulls represent the 11 people that he killed as part of the series that makes up a serial killer. But when he says things like Canadians don't count and he laughs it off, I feel like he means that. And I also think that there may be Canadian victims, and those may not be a part of his series. They're not part of the souls he may have collected, the We Are Ones. They may be the practice kills, and there may be others. In Colville, in Egypt, in Israel, in Belize, in California, in Texas, in Illinois, in Indiana, in Maine, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire. It goes on. But again, he was so effective at what he did, it's not just that his MO kept him from getting caught until he lost control, it made it incredibly difficult for his victims to be located. In his interviews, it's clear that he was as meticulous about the disposal of his victims as he was about the commission of the crimes themselves. Authorities never would have found Samantha Koenig if he didn't tell them where they were. They never would have known what happened to the couriers if he didn't tell them what he did. They still don't know where Deborah Feldman's remains are. He never gave that up. And look, in the true crime world, when you're contemplating a question like, how far did this person go? It's natural to have the instinct that it was more. It was the upper limit. And that's sort of how the genre conditions us, right? But I think in the case of Israel Keyes, after having poured through thousands of police documents, after having listened to 20 hours of this guy talking, after having spent hours talking to other people who knew him or investigated him, and seeing how he moved, and seeing where he moved, and seeing where he's been, and watching the way he traveled everywhere and just disappeared for large stretches at a time, I do think that 11 is the low end. And there are plenty of others out there that he may have considered practice kills or may not have considered a part of his 11 sacred souls for whatever reason. But yeah, I'll take the over on 11. And hopefully one day we'll find out who more of those victims are. With continued investigation and with your help, maybe these families can find some closure. And that, I think, is the ultimate way to, I guess, defeat Israel Keyes. It's to take the agency back for those families. It's to reclaim those souls. It's to make these people real, living beings who belong to families, not to Israel Keyes.
Hindsight's 20/20, but my perspective, my only regret is that I tried to have as much self-control as I did. I'm happy about the life I've lived, and as long as I got away with it. But that being said, it was, considering that's all I have now, it'd be better to have more memories.
So do you think that's a part, the memories part?
It is now.
Well, it is now. It's never was a consideration before. I was more interested in the next plan. Nothing ever goes exactly as planned. So, or maybe it does, but in your mind you up the ante as far as who or where or what happens, the order, the way things happen, how long it goes on. That's what constantly kept me obsessed with whatever the future might hold as opposed to the past. Tempered by the fact that I was always thought I had it all figured out.
In next week's Deviant, we'll tie up a few loose ends on Israel Keyes, answer some of your questions, and give you a preview of our next story, our next Deviant.
Don't forget to follow Deviant on your favorite podcast platform. Check out our Patreon for all sorts of new ways to experience the stories we're telling, and check us out on social. Follow us. You'll see more behind-the-scenes stuff and primary source material on TikTok and on Instagram at deviant.podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening. Deviant is written, produced, and executive produced by Clark Goldband, Andrew Iden, and me, Dan Szematowicz. Editorial and production consultation comes from the wildly creative Jenny Ament, with original scoring from the amazing Shuvo Sir. Marketing, sales, and distribution support come from our good friends at Gemini 13. Deviant is a production of Cold Open Media.